kiddo. Shabbat shalom. Glad you could make it. My daughter came to keep us company here in the sanctuary today. There's a wonderfully complicated moment in our Parsha in which Joseph counsels his newly rediscovered immigrant family. Joseph is now in charge of agricultural policy for the entire Egyptian empire, tasked with feeding much of the known world during a regional famine. His brothers and father are neophytes, herders from the Levant. Joseph is about to introduce them all to his boss, Pharaoh himself, and is nervous about the encounter. So when Pharaoh summons you and asks, "What is your occupation?" says Joseph, you shall answer, "Your servants have been breeders of livestock from the start until now, both we and our fathers, so that you may stay in the region of Goshen. Ki to'avat Mitzrayim kol ro'et son, for all shepherds are abhorrent to Egyptians." Now Joseph's family is not royal. Jacob and his sons are less sophisticated. They're nomadic goat herders. And Joseph may be fearful for them, perhaps embarrassed for himself, tells them not to lie per se, but to share a version of the truth. You're not shepherds, you're animal husbandry engineers. So what happens? Pharaoh does indeed ask them, "What is your occupation?" And the brothers reply, "Ro'et son avadecha, gam anachu gam avotenu." We are shepherds, and we, as were also our fathers. They say exactly what Joseph told them not to say. But guess who doesn't care? Guess who isn't fazed by Joseph's modest upbringing nor judgmental of his family occupation? "As regards your father and your brothers who have come to you, the land of Egypt is open before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them stay in the region of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." Not only is Pharaoh unfazed, he wants to hire them. You know a thing or two about sheep? Well, I've got sheep. I've got goats. Why don't you take care of them? The problem isn't Paro, and in this case, the problem isn't the brothers. The problem is Joseph and the assumptions he makes about his family story. Today, I want to talk about stories and the challenge of holding space for multiple stories, for complex narratives. After all, yesterday was Christmas, a day on which Jewish people in diaspora often feel like strangers in their own land. The anxiety Joseph brings to this moment, will his family fit in, is rooted in a fundamental question, one that author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie describes as the danger of a single story. Perhaps you've seen her TED Talk on the topic. It's been viewed 25 million times. Clearly, it resonates for many who have felt their collective stories flattened into something less nuanced and therefore less true. The consequence of a single story is this, says Adichie. It robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we're different rather than how we are similar. This is not to say that all peoples are the same. They aren't, and Adichie is deeply attuned to ways that power and global racism have affected her homeland of Nigeria. The policies that have decimated aspects of sub-Saharan African life for centuries are rooted in the single story Westerners have told about the continent. But a single story of Africa, let alone African oppression, trauma, or helplessness, told by those sympathetic to their plight, is no more useful or true than a single story told by oppressors or colonizers of African savagery or inferiority. So let's return to our Jewish story, or rather our stories. Joseph was wrong to assume one story about Egyptians and their views of shepherds, but history will show that he wasn't wrong to be wary. Life in Egypt does get hard for his people, particularly when a new pharaoh arises, Asher lo yada et Yosef, who didn't know Joseph. A pharaoh who subsequently begins to tell a single story about our people. Single stories can be weaponized, as I mentioned earlier, far too easily. Power, says Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. Our Jewish history shows that too often one single story or another has been wielded against us, including at this time of year. That history has led to some understandable anxiety about our future. High rates of intermarriage, diminishing synagogue affiliation, and increased skepticism about or outright condemnation of the state of Israel has some Jewish executives and philanthropists searching for solutions to ensure Jewish continuity. This is the impetus for something called the Jewish Future Pledge. Have you heard about this? According to their website, $68 trillion will transfer from Jewish people to the next generation in the next 25 years. That should leave approximately $6.3 trillion going to charity. Co-founders Mike Levin and Amy Holtz are asking Jewish folks to pledge 50% or more of the charitable giving in their estate plan to Jewish and/or Israel-related causes. In a recent article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Temple University historian Lila Corwin-Berman raises serious questions about the Jewish Future Pledge. She cites a particular older woman who signed saying, quote, she has lost confidence in the next generation of American Jews to support Israel or the Jewish values we hold dear. We made the money, she said. This is how you have to spend it. You don't have endless options. If you want to save the whales, save the Jewish whales. First of all, that's hilarious. But Corwin Berman isn't amused. The Jewish Future Pledge is remarkable, she writes, only because it is so transparent about the fear and capital resources driving it. Its tagline, fittingly, is "Leave your mark." This open bid to buy control over the future should compel us to ask critical questions about philanthropic accumulation and its claims on the future. Now, I don't disagree entirely. I am concerned about accumulation of generational wealth of tens of billions tied up in American donor-advised funds and not quickly reaching the public good, and in general about American quasi-deification of capitalism that's led to growing wage and wealth chasm between the very rich and, well, almost everyone else. But anxiety about the future can be instructive or self-defeating. Joseph's concerns about a future famine allowed him to prepare for the worst during times of plenty. That seems to be a motivation of this future pledge. But instead of worrying about food scarcity, their uneasiness is about shifting Jewish attitudes away from more particular concerns like Jewish education, socialization, and support of impoverished Jewish families. But lack of faith in the future is its own sort of problem too, is it not? For example, at the end of our Parsha, Joseph parlays his power, influence, and strategic agricultural planning into Egyptian serfdom, first acquiring cattle and later Egyptian lands for Pharaoh. Now, I want to be careful here. Joseph worked for the crown, and his actions are ultimately government policy. But as we Jews have seen throughout history, proximity to power is insufficient to protect us. And when we wield power in ways that are consonant with majority culture but dissonant with Torah values, when we help to increase suffering, even as we may be attempting to forestall it, there are natural consequences that get meted out. The enslavement of the Hebrew people was surely not the result of Joseph's agricultural policies, but it must have been a convenient excuse for those who wish to tell a single story about our ancestors. For my part, my biggest concern about the Jewish Future Pledge is not its stated goals. It's this growing fetishization of oath-making. Pledges, I think, ultimately do more harm than good. As medieval commentator Avraham ibn Ezra offers in on the third commandment in Exodus 20, Lo tisad Shem Hashem lashav, you shall not swear falsely by the name of Hashem your God. It is a custom among the people of Egypt, he writes, to this day, if a person swears on the head of the king and does not fulfill his oath, he's subject to death. And even if he were to offer a ransom of gold coins, he would not live because he had despised the king in public. If so, for a flesh and blood king, how many thousands of times more is one required to guard that his tongue not stumble and allow his mouth to cause his flesh to sin by a false appropriation of God's name? Our sages were quite wary. of swearing and signing pledges. But the flaw, I think, in Corwin Berman's critique is that it conveys some of the same provincial protectionist impulses she's criticizing within the Jewish philanthropic world. They have too little faith in the future, she says. But doesn't she have too little faith in Jewish causes, institutions, and the state of Israel? I don't know about the Jewish whales, but the landscape of Jewish organizational life is vibrant, dynamic, and ever-changing with the times. Designating philanthropic largesse isn't synonymous with parochial concerns. Who says giving to Jewish causes is not also giving to secular ones? Part of why Miriam and I made a substantial annual fund gift to Beth Am over the next 2 years is because I know our donation helps our community seek greater justice in West Baltimore. Jewish community at Beth Am radiates out into our neighborhood and seeks to use our physical plant as an effective anchor. See, for example, the wonderful Mitzvah Day yesterday organized by our Social Action Committee and the food distributions Adina and I were talking about earlier. One can give to Israel-related causes in all kinds of ways, and having more Jews Jewishly educated is likely to mean more Jews committed to the causes inspired by our most sacred texts. It's not an accident so many of us have been enmeshed in progressive causes like the battle for civil rights, Black Lives Matter, marriage equality, advocacy for immigrants and refugees. When we tell our stories, our Jewish stories, when we learn our stories, we become fuller and better expressions of our Jewish heritage. And that takes, frankly, investment in our future. The Jewish Future Pledge website reads, "None of the funds committed through this initiative go to us. You or your descendants choose the Jewish organizations and causes you want your donations to go to." In some ways, my life's work has been to convince Beth Am members and foundations and other funders alike that Jewish thriving and social justice are not mutually exclusive. Let me give you one example of the potential for moving beyond this binary thinking. The Associated recently sent out an email to a number of its supporters referencing its diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice plan. It reads, "The Associated's Baltimore City Partnerships Commission supports a healthy and thriving Baltimore, where the Jewish community actively works together to improve the quality of life for Baltimore residents through collaboration with partners and engagement with the city's diverse communities. Motivated by Jewish values, the Commission strengthens Baltimore City through partnerships that foster safe and healthy neighborhoods for all residents, with a focus on Jonestown, Reservoir Hill, and Park Heights. We look forward to continuing conversations with our partner organizations, Jewish Museum of Maryland, Beth Am, and Chai, respectively, to foster additional connections between communities." Now, this collaboration didn't come about by accident. It reflects years of conversations between various stakeholders, and the Partnerships Commission includes numerous residents of our neighborhood here in Reservoir Hill and Beth Am members as well, including a number of Jews of color. Further conversations will unfold with IFO and community representatives in the coming months. We don't yet know where this will lead, but I, for one, am all the more enthusiastic about making my annual commitment to the Jewish Federation, knowing it has chosen to pursue this course. Chevra, faith in the Jewish people is also faith in our capacity to evolve and grow in our awareness of the broader world, and that the broader world is capable of doing the same. Professor Corwin Berman writes, "How far into the future can a philanthropist possibly imagine what will be good for society? The stated purpose of philanthropy and the rationale for its tax exemption is the advancement of the public good, but the public good is not static. Philanthropy that seeks to define the future by imposing ideals from the past has the potential to immortalize racist, sexist, environmentally destructive, and unjust policies." Yes, it does. But it has the equally powerful potential of furthering work for gender equity, racial justice, and sustainability. Some donors are enshrining their pledge in directed giving to specific causes. This, I agree, is a mistake. Making a bequest or a legacy gift, say to Betham, is one thing and a good thing. Tying up dollars in perpetuity to a discrete cause is something else. Miriam and I want our children to find their own Jewish paths, practically, philanthropically, and otherwise. Part of raising them as committed Jews is to trust them to follow Darchei Noam, our tradition's pleasant and purposeful paths. In other words, we want them to make our Jewish stories their own stories. Ultimately, the flaw in Corwin Berman's approach is that it assumes the Jewish cause is not and cannot be synonymous with the public good. But if Judaism is a lived expression of God's will, of the notion that human life is sacred, that human dignity is paramount, then why would we not want to pledge future gifts to Jewish causes and worthy Jewish institutions? Corwin Berman accuses promoters of the Jewish Future Pledge of operating from a place of cynicism, of being no more hopeful for the future than it is for our present. But on this matter, as opposed to much of her other writing, of which I am a big fan, she seems equally cynical about the possibility of Jewish values fulfilled and Jewish community done well. I'll close with a midrash on next week's parsha, the conclusion of the Joseph story. The midrash notices that when Joseph brings his sons to his father to receive a final blessing, Jacob, here called Israel, asks, Mi ele, who are these? Could it be that Jacob didn't know his own grandchildren? Rather, this was a test. Jacob was observing that Manasseh and Ephraim little resembled the rest of his family. They looked like Egyptians, dressed like Egyptians, probably walked like Egyptians. If I'm going to give them my blessing, thought Jacob, I'd better be sure they understand who we are and what we stand for. According to the Midrash, the boys reply, Shema Yisrael, listen Israel, listen Jacob, listen Zadie. Adonai Eloheinu, we may look Egyptian, but we worship the same God. Adonai Echad. And while here in Egypt there are many gods we might serve, our firm commitment is to the Jewish people and Jewish peoplehood. Satisfied, the Torah goes on to tell us Jacob blessed Ephraim and Manasseh and did so with the words traditionally used to bless male children to this day, Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chim Manasseh. Parenting is hard. We all make mistakes, and children ultimately have to find their way forward in life. Jacob doesn't bless his grandchildren to be something different, and he certainly doesn't bless them to be like himself. He blesses them to be like Ephraim and Manasseh, to be their best selves. Pledge or no pledge, if we've done our job as parents and grandparents, isn't this the best any of us can hope for our descendants? Shabbat Shalom.